Today we're going to be continuing the tier list series with the Northern Realms tier list, and let's just begin by going over the tiers again. We have Excellent. These are cards that are played very often across the faction or are deck defining for a good deck in the faction. We have Good cards. These are cards that are played. It'll be like fit into good decks. You'll see them in there, or you can consider playing them in most stuff. We have the OK cards. These are considerations, but they're usually suboptimal. These are cards you might play like a one of for a bronze. Like you've got 5 versions left, you might consider putting this in sometimes. Or they're cards that like you can play them over other cards, but usually in most circumstances the other cards would be better. But maybe sometimes it's okay. Then we have niche cards. These are rarely seen but have their moments. These are either deck defining for bad decks or not as good decks as the top tier cards. Or they're going to be like cards that sometimes in a specific meta they'll be really amazing, but most of the time they're not. We have weak cards. These are cards that are not played, but they could be with a buff. So these are things that are just below like what you'd consider like their value is a little too low or they're too specific that you're never really going to expect to see value from them. But if they got buffed, maybe you could play them. And we have bad cards. These cards definitely need buffs, and you should probably generally avoid these. And there's generally not really a consideration, like a reason to put them in your deck. Even like sometimes like a weak card or niche card, you feel like maybe it'll be good in this meta or it'll be good in this specific deck. Bad cards don't have a spot where you feel like you ever really want to include them. They're the meme cards, which are unplayable other than for fun. So those are the tiers. Let's get into it here. Good old Northern Realms, known for, I think, having a lot of bad bronze cards, but we'll see if that's actually true or not. I didn't think that is the general perception of them. So, beginning off, here we have the Mauler. The Aedirnian Mauler. I think this is the only Aedirnian card in the whole game, too. So, 4 for 4 with order, damage enemy by 2. So, it's melee, by the way. So, this card is absolutely atrocious. We're going to stick it in bad tier. So, for a 4-fishing card, for a good amount of value, you'd expect like 7-ish. Like, this would be pretty reasonable-ish. This guy does 6, conditional on having his order go off, and it's row locked. It's really bad. Next up, we have Alumni. So Alumni here, 5 for 6. It's got the Human Mage. Most of you know what Alumni is. So it's got Deploy. It gains Zeal if both of its values are 4 or higher, and the values are based on how high your students got this game. Melee being the Banard and range being the Aretuza. So Alumni is an insane payoff card to that deck. That deck, though, I don't think it's an amazing deck. I kind of think the deck's pretty not great. It's countered too easily by control, but it is a meta-dependent deck. Alumni is absolutely the best card in that deck, though. The entire reason you play it is to make Alumni and replay Alumni as many times as possible to use its amazing order. Considering that, I think it's going to go in niche here. I kind of want to put it in excellent, but the Mage Alumni deck is generally just not that great most of the time. Like in certain metas, it's okay, but most of the time it's just not great. So I'm gonna put it in niche here, but it's by far the best card in the deck. Actually, I'm gonna put this in excellent. Put all the other Mage cards in niche, I think, just because like you absolutely only play them because of Alumni. Yeah, I think I like that. Next up, we have the Aretuza. Of course, if it's spelled right, you show up, and we're gonna go with the Adept next. So this girl, I should say, is a 4 for 5. And whenever Patience is triggered, boost self by 1. Patience cards generally have the downside of they're not generating points over time until you click the order. This makes up for that by giving you the points each turn. However, generally it's not as good as maybe saying another copy of your Patience cards. So I'm going to say this card is pretty niche. It's even niche for the Alumni decks. You don't often see it there. Then we have the Aretuza Student. I think I already talked about this mainly in the Alumni. Both the Aretuza and Banard students are going to go in niche. You only play them because you have to make Alumni better and give Alumni its orders. And the other thing with this is you play because it's a Patience card for Practice Makes Perfect. So I'm going to stick it right in there. And we're going to do the same thing with Banard student right now, although I will show it up here on the screen real quick for people who don't know what it is. The same thing, it's order, and it has the Patience. Outside of Mages, these cards are really bad because there's a better 1 point per turn engines that are not row locked and don't have to make you click the order. This is only viable because of Alumni and Mages in general. Next up, we have Ballista. Now, Ballista is a cool card that saw more play than it used to see more play than it does now. So it's a 3 for 4 siege engine. That's like a good typing, right? 3 for 4 siege engine's good to have because there's siege. And at 3 for 4, it has an deploy to deal 1 damage and order deal 2. So total 6 value, 3 of which is control, spread out across 2 turns. This used to be played for Revenant decks to give you setup for the Revenants, but now there's generally better ways to do that. and it just doesn't see any play even in siege decks because they like the cooldown effects from the resupply. So generous card's a little bit weak at the moment, unfortunately. Now we have to go on to the Banned Tutor. So whenever you play a unique special card, you boost himself by 2, and at a 4 power for 5 provision stat line, that is going to have to go off at least 3 times for you to want to be happy with this. The downside of this, as opposed to other engine cards, is you generally can't trigger this the turn you put it down. Something like Witch Apprentice gets 2 points if you Sabbath. Even like 1 point per turn engines, just like we'll get to later, just get their points at the end of the turn. This doesn't, so it's easy to remove at 4 power, which makes it quite weak, actually. This thing's super easy to kill, and because of that, it's just not good. It's bad, actually. This definitely is a card that needs buffs. Next up, we have Battering Ram. A pretty fun one. Very thematic. I like the theme on this. So 4 for 5, Siege Engine again. Resupply, so it gets this cooldown reduced. You play Warfare, so you always love seeing that. Then we have Order Melee, Move Ranged. And Order Range, move melee, and deal the highest power enemy by 3. Now, if you take into account here that this is a 4-turn cycle, basically, because it's cooldown 2, it's not exactly good value-wise, but it is good because it's damage if you can target it. It's good because you can cool down it with the resupplies. Generally, most players don't play this other than the one you get off of Siege, but it is okay. Like, you can play this. I have played it, and specifically in Siege Mutagenerator decks where you want to play a bunch of 5 provision cards. The fact this is a 5 provision Siege engine kind of fits in there alright, so you could consider it. And it's okay in the decks that do play a lot of Warfares. Next up, we have Blue Stripes Commando. Blue Stripes Commando here, 4 for 5, order summon all copies of itself from your deck. So this on the surface, this looks like a thinning card that's below average stat lines, right? Like, it thins something out of your deck, but that's not what you use this for. You use this to make Blue Stripes Commando's base deck, where you spam as many of these things as possible, shuffle them back into your deck with Pavetta, and bring them all out round 2 and all out round 3, after renewing Pavetta, for example, for a massive tempo play, and you zeal them so you get their orders off. That deck is not that great at the moment, but this is the defining card for it, so this is going to go in niche. When that deck got 1 power buff to Blue Stripes Commando, no one could handle it, and everyone just reverted it. So not anymore, it's not going to be up in good tier. So sticking down here. For the same exact reason, the Scout is going to go in there too. So Scout spawns a base copy of a bronze neutral unit, non-neutral unit on the bottom of your deck. So you usually use this on, no, it's not surprisingly, the Blue Stripes Commando, although you can do it on a card we'll get to in a little bit as well, but it's only in those decks, it's only to support them. Because of that, it does actually have a spot in the game, and it's pretty good in those decks, so it's going to get the niche tier, kind of like we talked about when we went over the tiers. Next up, we have Boiling Oil. So Boiling Oil is the 5 damage special card the faction has access to. Most factions have one of those. So 5 damage, Death Blow, Purify adjacent units. It is a Warfare, which is nice because it cools down all the resupplies. It has the Purify is kind of... The Purify usually doesn't come up. Usually just plays for 5 damage, but every now and then, someone will play a 5 power card next to a Sirinova or something. You get the chance to Purify it, which is quite nice. All in all, this is just a solid, good card for the faction. Next up, we have another... 1 second, guys. Hold on. Sorry, guys. We were invaded by a cat that was climbing on my shoulders, and I had to remove that because that's not very conducive to recording. I'll put a picture in of... I put her in a box, so she's now happy in a box. Anyway, let's go back on with the tier list. So we have other Warfare here in Bombardment. So we've got Bombardment here, split 4 damage randomly among all enemy units, increased by 1 for each siege engine you control. Random damage isn't that great, but obviously if they only have 1 card and it's 4 power, you can kill it with this. It's 4 Persian, so it's pretty cheap. In fact, as a Warfare, it cools down your siege engines, which is quite nice. Siege engines with resupply, at least. All in all, Bombardment is pretty solid. It's also really nice because a lot of the decks that play Mutagenerator, I'm mentioning Mutagenerator because it's pretty important to the faction a lot of times. Not as much as it used to be, but still impactful. It's a pretty solid card all in all because it cools down your stuff. It can trigger things. If you're playing a deck that wants Mutagenerator, for example, on 5 Persian units, this is like a card you can fit in for your 4 Persians, blah, blah, blah. All in all, this is a pretty solid card. Not as good as Boiling Oil, but it's still pretty decent, and you do see it occasionally. Well, not occasionally, you see it pretty frequently in Siege decks. Speaking of Siege decks and Warfares, we have Kerack. So this is a 5 for 5 that's got resupply, Order, range, deal it 2 damage, and cooldown 3. So at 5 power, you usually can hit it with a bronze removal card, and it's pretty solid. The opponent will want to answer this because it's pretty good. It gives 2 damage the next turn, which is nice, and then 3 turns after that, 2 more damage, at which point you're pretty happy with it getting 9 value. But this is a card that cools down pretty frequently because you are going to be playing Warfares with this out there. The crew that gives it armor can make it a little hard to remove for the opponent. Usually you don't have that set up, but sometimes you will. And all in all, things with like Stockpile that love to have cooldowns, this is a pretty good deck for them, or a pretty good card for that deck. And all in all, it's a solid, good card. Next up, we have Casting Contest. So, Casting Contest is a spell, as you can see here. It just does 5 provisions, boosts by 5, and if it's bronze, reset its order and give it Zeal. Now, Casting Contest. It's played outside of just mages, which is what you might think at the moment. I'm just going to stick it here while we talk about it. So you can reset orders. Most orders are not worth that many points. As you can see, like Kerack, most of the times they're worth like 2 points, which case this is not as good as something else. You should rather play a Warfare to cool down the abilities instead of Casting Contest, but it's not the worst value. And the one thing you really can take advantage of this on is Reaver Scouts, where you can just reset and play whole cards. So this sees play outside of just these decks because of that. So for that reason, I think I'm going to put it in okay, actually. It's not as niche as these guys, but this is a card you could play in any deck really that has some decent orders. Usually you're not going to want to, but you could actually play this. Like if you just look at it objectively, playing this on a battering ram, for example, is 5 points, and you're resetting the order. Kerack, it's worth 7. It's not the worst thing. No one ever does it because you want the cooldown reduction on all the resupply cards. But because it goes on stuff like the, Reaver Scouts, all that kind of stuff, Reaver Hunters, it gets played in other decks than just this, so I'm going to put it in okay because of that. Yeah, I'm going with okay because of that. I would move it up to good because it is played a lot in those decks, but those decks aren't good. So I'm going to put it in okay just above niche because it plays in multiple decks. I could be convinced otherwise on that one. Next up, we have the Cintrian Artificer. This card is actually surprisingly doesn't suffer from the issue most protection cards do. It's got formation, so you can play it 4 for 4 or 4 for 5 if you go ranged and want to have that order instead of the Zeal effect. Almost always a protection card you want to set up to protect your other cards proactively. And Cintrian Artificer does that pretty well because you play it ranged, it gets to 1 point for formation, so it goes to 5, a little harder to kill. And then when you play your important card next turn, you give it a shield. The downside of this is that shield wall exists. It is generally better to put a shield wall charge on something because you can do it the same turn as you play a card and develop your engines faster. This card's just a little bit weak. Like, it's not terrible though. This card's almost there. I think it's got like a power buff. It might be alright actually. Next up, we have the Cintrian Enchantress. So she's a 4 for 4 with deploy ranged, give an allied unit 2 vitality, and bonded 4. Now, Northern Realms is not the bonded faction. For those of you who don't know, or not the bonded faction, the vitality faction. For those of you who don't know, this effect was originally on the Scoia'tael bonded card, and they did some reworks and shifted it over to the Cintrian Enchantress after they added some more cards and changed some stuff. So this was originally an effect in Scoia'tael, which makes a lot more sense. In Northern Realms, this card is just not good. It doesn't synergize with the deck. It doesn't synergize with what the Mage deck does. It just, yeah, it doesn't do too much. It almost feels like this card should have if the target was a knight because it's a damsel lady. I mean, she's an enchantress. She kind of looks like a damsel. I don't know. It's not feeling it. That's not it. Card you do see sometimes, though, is Cintrian Envoy. So it's got formation. Formation's either Zeal or +1 if you're playing ranged. Or to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and move one. Look at the 3 random cards from your deck and move one to the top. So you're going to take 3 cards randomly from your deck, put one on top. Now you can keep repeating this every 2 turns and just stack your deck. It's a decent way to do consistency. The only thing with this is Northern Realms, I think other than Nilfgaard's probably the most consistent faction. Could do stuff like Amphibious Assault. So I think this card, it's all right. You do see it in some decks, but usually the decks that want to play this for consistency will end up playing things like Griffin Witchers, Mentors for like Malili Temple Priestess, and you have Pincer Maneuver, which is a super consistent leader. So this card generally just sees play in Shoop decks. But it is in those it does make the cut in those decks, and you can play it just as a consistency tool if you want to go with it as opposed to something else, say in a 4 provision mutant generator deck. Next up, we have Cintrian Knight. So Cintrian Knight's got that 3 power, 4 provisions, does 2 damage when you play it, Death Blow 2 Vitality, and Grace boost self. So you can see the value here, right? You play it, 2 damage, it's 5, gets the 2 Vitality, that's 7, that's a conditional 7. That's not too bad, and then Grace 6 boosts self by 2. Once you get to the Grace, gives himself 2 more points. If he does all this himself, it's really nice. Unfortunately, you have to buff him up by something else usually, but it's a pretty solid card actually. Cintrian Knight is a pretty good card in Knights because they play it. Like Knights play this card, and outside of Knights, like Knights isn't the best Northern Realms deck, but it's the most popular one I see, and it's still pretty good. I don't give him a good for being in Knights, and you can play him outside of it. If you're playing something with like a Revenant deck, you can actually set up the Death Blow if you don't have Revenants out or something. And generally, the Grace 2 lets you trigger it off of these Knight scenarios, so you love playing it in there. And you can put like a Mad Charge on this if you want or something. Just buff it up to get those extra 2 points. If you're going to be boosting things indiscriminately or just generally as value, for example, if you're playing Temerian Drummer and this just happen to play it, put this next to it, the 2 value from this will actually be pretty solid. It gets good value for a 4 provision card. Next up, we have Cintrian Royal Guard. So this guy used to see a lot more play. But it's 5 for 5, and it boosts himself by each other Cintrian Royal Guard you have. It has allied, but since it's a deploy, it's really each other because it checks the deploy first. So he doesn't boost himself to 8. He boosts himself. His first one's 5, 8. And the problem with this is most people will just kill the first one. And if you kill the first one, all the subsequent ones have 3 less points, which is a pretty big deal. But you can make a deck around this. It was much more popular when the Reaver Scouts were at 5 provisions. You could be insane with those. But overall, it's a niche card. It's amazing in the Cintrian Royal Guard deck. It tends to be comboed with Reavers because they use the same order sometimes. But it's still really good in those decks. And those decks aren't great, but this is a key card in them. So next up, we have the Cintrian spellweaver, 4 for 5. Order damage unit by 1, charge 1. Whenever you play a spell or mage, gain a charge. Now this card has a lot of potential with things like Runebird that will make a mage, so being a special and being a spell and then making a mage, I should say. And you get a whole bunch of charges and you just zap out and kill everything. It's pretty neat. I've tried this out in I've tried this out in what's it called? Reaver, not Reaver. I hate Reavers. Cavalry Revenant decks has another way to take advantage of it because stuff like Forbidden Magic are spells. That being said, this card is really good sometimes, and it's not great sometimes, but you used to actually see sometimes people would play Mobilization on this, because you get 2 that are pretty big, and then you spam out a whole bunch of fleeter charges and zap everything. I'm going to say this thing's okay. I don't think it's as niche as some of these other cards. You could make decks around it. You can fit it into things like Revenants that aren't great decks, but it has some uses, and the fact that it has charges and orders, like that's pretty good for things like Onager. Usually you don't play it in those decks, but since it is a 5, you could consider it, but usually you don't because it's not going to be resetting its own charges that often, and there's other stuff that's better. So yeah, I think I'm going to go with niche still. Yeah, I'm still going with niche on this one. It's closer to not niche, but I'm going to just put it here. Next up, we have the Cursed Knight, a very interesting card despite a simple effect. 6 for 4. Pretty solid stat line, and deploy transform an allied unit that is not Cursed Knight into Cursed Knight without changing its power. So what you want to do with this is transform things that have status effects like Rupture, like Poison, like disloyal cards like False Series. So it's generally a one-of inclusion, but it has a lot of uses. Rupture is not very common anymore because Trig V got nerfed. Well, not nerfed, power crept, I should say. And then you've got stuff like False Series. When that's popular, you can just Cursed Knight it. And just generally, Cursed Knight's a good one-of, because if you want to purify, as opposed to like Peller, if you're going to purify something, the Cursed Knight is worth 2 more points. And it's pretty reasonable that way. Of course, if they're poisoning something that has an effect, you're losing out on that effect because it's no longer going to be that card. It's going to be Cursed Knight. But the flexibility of it being able to remove spying cards, I should say disloyal cards, is pretty good. So I think this card's pretty okay. Usually you can consider it for your deck, but often people like pick for a Peller instead. That being said, if you are in Devotion, which Northern Realms is a deck or a faction that likes Devotion fairly often, it's pretty good as an inclusion. Next up, we have the Sorceress, 4 for 5. She has Zeal Order, remove a unit shield and boost self by 2, cooldown 1. So every turn you can remove a shield and get 2 points. What you see everyone do with this is play Immortals, which brings its own shield back and gives it self points. And that makes a 4 point 4-point per turn combo that the opponent has to deal with. And the fact that it's boosted itself by 2 means it goes up to 6 right away, which is very hard to remove without like playing gold cards, which is quite strong. And the fact is you can remove opponent shields too. So if they remove your immortals, for example, sometimes they'll have like a Siri or whatever. You can move their shields and get your points. You can put shields out from shield wall. The Witchers, Adepts put out a bunch of shields. There's a whole bunch of uses for this. And it's a very strong engine card that you can sometimes get extra value from by using on the opponent's cards. I'm going to put this in excellent. Super strong across the faction. Yeah, it's just super strong across the faction completely. A whole bunch of decks will just play Immortals plus Sorceress as an engine piece. Gold Necro decks do it because it's cheap and an engine piece. They don't cost much provisions. Even Northern Realms Knights will do it. It's pretty common across a lot of decks. Next up, we have the Dun Banner. So Dun Banner is a 4/4, and when it receives a boost, summon all copies from your deck. You can use this almost like a Blue Stripes Commando. You can make a Dun Banner deck very similarly, because you'll just put more copies on the bottom of your deck, and then, you know, they come out. You can use Pavetta to shuffle them back in. This is the same power as a Blue Stripes Commando. It's a cheaper provision. And generally the issue with this is, well, not the issue, you just put a leader charge on it, and then it would come out from several different leaders. You don't even have to zeal this, just whenever it's boosted. So overall, this card gets the same rating as Blue Stripes Commando for the same reason. On the face of it, it could be a thinning card. It's much better as a thinning card than Blue Stripes Commando because you don't have to use you don't have to give it zeal. You can just boost it with something, which is pretty easy. But no one really does that because the Northern Realms has a lot of consistency tools already. It doesn't need the Dun Banner for consistency. You might see it occasionally, but most of the time people just use this in its own Dun Banner deck, which is not that great of a deck. It's about the same tier as this one because it's basically the same thing. Next up, if we have a Field Medic. So Field Medic is 2/4. And it has boost adjacent units by 2. Now, conditional 6/4, it's really not where it's at here. This card is absolutely terrible. This card is just going to go in bad. I'm not going to give it meme because it could be playable if it was like 4 or something power, but I mean, this card is so bad at the moment. Next up, we have Forbidden Magic. Forbidden Magic here, 5 spell, damage enemy by 2, death blow, summon a Cavalry Revenant. Cavalry Revenant is a very, very strong engine card if it gets going. This makes you get an extra copy. This is kind of key to decks that want to make a whole bunch of Revenants. The thing with this is that Cavalry Revenant is also a death blow card, so it's kind of hard to always have enough death blows for this and Cavalry Revenant unless you're playing a lot of damage, which you can in this. And if you don't have the death blows card, it's absolutely awful, but you're going to be playing a deck that wants to set up those death blows, so you should be able to do it. And overall, this card just gives you a Revenant. This is going to get the same tier as the Cavalry Revenant. No, it won't, because Revenant fits into a whole bunch of decks. This card doesn't. It only goes in specifically Revenant decks. I'm going to say it's weak. Yeah, the fact that you have to use this to get a Revenant, I don't think... Well, the Revenant's 5 provisions now, so this gives you a Revenant and 2 extra damage, essentially. But usually you're just happier playing the Revenants and just giving them Inspired Zeal or something, rather than playing this to make an extra Revenant. Still, though, and the Revenant deck's not great at the moment. Next up, we have the Griffin Witchers. Let's grab all the Griffins here. Let's start up with the Adept. So 5/5 with shield. So very hard to remove. Not even Turning Joust gets through this thing anymore. Used to. Transform an allied Witcher into base copy of himself. So the reason this is so good is most of the Witchers you're going to transform are 2 power tokens, which means every time you're using this, it is 3 additional points on your board. Get a whole bunch of copies of this. They all have shields, so if you want to play King Rognar, you can. They can absorb damage with the shields. This is the key card in Northern Realms Witchers, which is probably the most popular / best, probably best, one of the best Northern Realms decks at the moment. This card is amazing, combos super well with the Sorceress because you can remove the shield from it, transform the one you remove the shield from back to give it the shield. There's a whole bunch of uses for it. Just very, very strong card. Next up, we have Griffin Witcher Mentor, 4/5. So it's got deploy, draw their top unit and boost it by 1, shuffle card back into your hand. Remember, always draws a unit, which is kind of nice. So if your deck is full of specials, you know you're going to get your 1 unit. And draw on the floor, it draws 2 and shuffles them back. So it's storing points on the cards you draw, which is kind of nice, and it shuffles back in. The only thing people really do with this is play it for the Traveling Priestess deck. It is incredibly key to that deck, though, and you kind of can't play it outside of it. I don't think it's deck defining to the Traveling Priestess deck. It's really close, though. I'm going to give it the Priestess, I think. But this is definitely a good card. You can also use it outside of that, because you have stuff like Snowdrop that will just get you points if you're playing it for literally such things. And this just gets a whole bunch of use out of any deck that wants to draw, any deck that wants to shuffle stuff back, so like literally Traveling Priestess, all that stuff. And outside of that, it's not a bad card. Like, you can play Kerack and get this thing and play it. People do that. But overall, I think it's just a solid, good card in those decks. Those decks are pretty good. On the other hand, we have the Griffin Witcher Ranger here, so it's a 2 for 5 with formation, and it boosts itself by 1 for each unit on an enemy row. Now, what you ideally want to do with this is have an opponent have a full row, and then play this and store all the boosts on it and give the boost to a dual card. That's like the ultimate dream. The downside of this is that that's not really going to happen very often. Most of the time, you're going to get like 5 or so points on this. Like, they'll have 4 units on a row, maybe 5. You'll get the formation for +1 point. It's going to be like 7 or 8 points, which isn't terrible, but it's kind of specific, and it's really bad in short rounds where they don't have many units. So I think just in general, this card is a bit on the weaker end, unfortunately. I don't know if it's actually weak or just a consideration. Let me think. I've seen like a couple people play it, but usually it's just made as an option off of Kerack. So I think at the moment we're going to give this weak. People don't really use it. Its effect is too specific that having enough units out for it's usually kind of hard, and the payoff of it, putting on dual cards, like usually you want to play Temple of Melitele or Shield Wall instead. So it's going to go right down here for now. Last of the Witchers then is going to be regular old Griffin Witcher, 5 for 5, order melee, deal damage to an enemy unit by 1. So 1 damage per turn engine is pretty reasonable. There's a couple of those. And then it's got cooldown 1, naturally. We talked about that, kind of. I overlooked it. Should have said it out loud. Then we have Adrenaline 3 at the end of your turn, damage a random enemy by 3 and locks up. So he's 1 damage per turn until you get to Adrenaline 3. Then he does 3 burst damage and locks himself. A ton of decks will just play him because if you give him Veil, he can't lock himself. So Crystal Skull, for example, you just play him, put Crystal Skull on him, and then you get 3 points a turn once the Adrenaline ticks down. The opponent kind of has to kill it. 3 points per turn plus the 1 on its order. The opponent kind of has to kill this if you put it with a Crystal Skull. I'm going to give this excellent. It's a very strong card, and decks will sometimes just play this because they have a Crystal Skull, and if they draw this, they put Crystal Skull on it, and they're super happy. It's very, very good. I think it's one of the best cards in Witchers in general because people love to put like Sangreal on this because it'll lock the Sangreal effect after purifying it for 3 more damage. It has a ton of uses. And Witchers are a super strong deck at the moment, so we'll put this in it. Next up, we have Immortal Cavalry. This is a card I've always really liked. I just like the art on this guy. I don't really know why, I just do. But it's got 4 for 5, shield, and spawn a base copy of himself. So 8 for 5 total points with shields. If the shields absorb damage, it's played for 10, which is nice. That's quite good. If the shields don't absorb damage, it's not as good. But it does give you 2 bodies at once, which is nice, especially for swarmy decks that want the bodies to stick because they have shield. They're kind of hard to get rid of. And then it's just playing for decent enough value. I think this is an okay card. I don't think it's weak. If this thing got buffed at all, it'd be insane. But it's okay. Like, if you're playing a deck like Queen Meve, or you're playing a deck like King Rognar, you consider putting this card in your deck just as a way to get 2 guys with shield out, or 2 guys on the board at a reasonable stat line. Like 8 for 5 is okay. You don't love it, but if the shields ever do any work for you, it's going to be pretty good. So I'm gonna say it's pretty okay. Next up, we have, what's this guy called? It's Kedweni something. Kedweni Cavalry. A lot of cavalry in Northern Realms. 4 for 4, shield. Whenever this unit loses shield, boost self by 2. So, the best case scenario here is you remove the shield with this, and then you put a shield back on and remove it for 2 points again, and keep doing that. However, there's better ways to do that. You can use Knight Errant to get an infused shield. You can use Immortals, which is far, far, far better. This just doesn't have the value on the removal for it to be worth it. Like, the fact that it's removes it by 2, you have to remove it twice for it to be good. If this only had to remove once for it to be good, like say this was remove like boost 3 per shield, or it's like base power is higher, maybe. But right now, this card is really, it's really bad. Like, it doesn't have it. You don't want to be removing shields from other cards other than this. Next up, we have, Kedweni Knight. So this is a 4 for 4 that's when played or summoned from the deck, boost self by 3. So it's a 7 for 4 conditional, but the condition is obnoxious. Here's the thing. There's not a good way to summon this out of your deck. And it's not a good way to play it out of your deck, because what happens here is, say, well, sure, let's say you have Amphibious Assault or something. You really don't want to be using tutor cards on 4 provision bronzes. You want to be using tutor cards on your expensive gold cards or your key bronze cards that are integral to your strategy. So, for example, an Onager, for example, Reinforced Ballista if you have Onagers, your students or alumni. So you don't want to be using on this, because this is just a 7 for 4 upside if you tutor out. And summoning out of the deck, there's not a great way to do that. So overall, this card is really just going to fall into the meme tier here. Like, it doesn't have really anything going for it. And the fact is, you really don't want to be tutoring this thing out, like, ever. Next up, we have the Revenant. So Revenant, I got a little buff, and then I got a nerf. Now it's at 4 for 5, with order deal 1 damage, and death will spawn a Revenant. Note you can damage your own cards with this, which makes some other cards in the faction quite useful. That will maybe spawn 1 power tokens, I mean. Overall, this is an incredibly powerful engine. If you get this off one time, you have 9 for 5, which is really good, and you still have another one on the board and can do it again. So this card can just take games out of control. Often people just inspire to deal the first one so they get the good value out of it, and then your opponent has to still deal with the other one. It's just super powerful. I'm going to say this is an excellent card. You don't see as much as you used to, but it is still played in a lot of different decks. It has a lot of potential to it. It's not niche. Like, you can make Revenant decks, but you don't play it in Revenant decks. You just, like, put it in your other decks. I think it's really good. The thing is, at the moment, its decks aren't the most popular decks. Like, I've seen more Knights, I've seen more Witchers than Temple Siege decks, or for example, or Temple Demovan decks. But I think it still warrants being up here. It's incredibly powerful, and a lot of decks will still play it. Even if their decks aren't the most popular decks, they're still pretty good. I think it's definitely worth, the excellent tier. It's played a lot across different decks. Just because if it goes off, you're kind of just winning. I could see an argument to move this down, though. I just think it's very, very strong. Next up, we have Kedweni's Sergeant, 3 for 4 with formation. He has 3 charges to boost. Now, if you play him ranged at that formation, he's going to play for 7, which is reasonable. You play him melee, put those charges out right away. I think this card's okay. It's getting a little bit more play. It didn't used to get any play at all, but it gets a little more play now that Cohen's been buffed, because it's a nice way to set up Cohen by boosting your cards more. Other than in Cohen decks, though, you don't really see it. And there's better ways, better cards to play, so I think we'll just leave him in okay. Like, when I make a Cohen deck, I usually don't include him, but I think about it. Next up, we have the Kerack City Guard. An interesting one for sure here. So 3 for 5 with Veil, and it has, at the end of your turn, if you have not used the order, it gets a point. So it's 3 for 5. I have 1 point per turn Veil Engine. Veil Engines are great because they don't get locked. And it has order, move a unit to the other route. So you just leave it, you just play it proactively. You have it out there, and it gets its 1 point per turn. If they ever play something you need to move, you just click the order on this thing and move it. It's really solid overall. You don't see it in a ton of decks. This is usually played in Muta Generator decks only, because those decks like to play 5 version cards, and this is a good 5 version card to include in those. Muta Generator is not the most popular deck at the moment, but I still think this card is played in a lot of them. I haven't seen too many, though. It's not as good as Kero Ballista. I think this is going to go in the okay alongside Battering Ram. They're played in the same deck for the same reason, just because they're good 5 version cards. Next up, we have, this is going to be the Kerack group here. We have the Kerack Cutthroat. So he's formation, order, give 3 bleeding. So again, conditional 7 if you've played it ranged with the formation and it waits a turn to use its order. However, that's not as good as most 7 conditional cards, because it has to give out the bleeding, which means you have to wait 3 of the opponent's turns for it to get value. Overall, this card's just a little bit weak. Just a little weak. You don't really ever see this card being played. There's better cards that give you more value immediately, but it's not terrible. It's just, if it got like a buff to maybe 4 power, maybe it'd see play, but at the moment, not quite. Next up, we have Kerack Frigate. So this is a 5 for 6 with 1 armor, so it's pretty hard to remove, actually. It's a pretty sticky engine, that 1 armor. It's got resupply, so you can reduce its cooldown, which is nice, and its order is to spawn a volunteer with cooldown 2 and crew cooldown 1. I will note here, so I know a lot of newer players watch the tier list, the crew condition will check after you've clicked the order. So you will check the crew condition last. So if you have a soldier to the left of this, you click its order, it spawns the volunteer on the right of it. If there's no unit to the right of frigate, it will then check the crew condition, see there's a volunteer there now, and then you'll have cooldown 1. So it is quite nice for that. And you can get 2 points a turn here on a row if you keep filling up the row. Some stuff loves to have this, like Queen Meve, Golden Necker decks will love this. Decks that love to swarm, like Melitaly, might love this. It has a lot of good uses, and it's actually pretty hard to remove. At the moment, I think this card's pretty reasonable. I'm going to give this card a questionable good. It got buffed pretty recently, and I haven't seen a ton of it. But when I do see it, does seem to be pretty good. And in the Golden Necker Meve decks, which I've played a decent amount myself, it's a pretty good card in there. Those decks are better than the decks, like when I say these things are niche down here. I think it's better than those, and it's pretty important to them. But I don't think it's deck defining because you can work around with those. I think it's just a solid, good card for the swarmy type decks. You can argue those decks aren't too popular, but I've seen a decent number of them. So I'm going to leave this in good, but I could see an argument to either put it down here or like in here or here. If you think it's a deck defining card or whatever, I'm just going to put it in here just because it spawns those little tokens. And you can actually play this in Siege if you want to, although I haven't seen many people trying that out. It's pretty fun to give you enough for your crew that you don't otherwise have in Siege decks. Next up, we have the Kerack Marine 3/4. This is the Devotion Bronze. So it has Zeal Order boost by 2. No one ever does that. Zeal Order Devotion boost by 4. So when I said there's better for options at 4 provisions for value, this is it. If you're playing Devotion, this card is pretty great. But you don't even always include it, though. I'm going to give this card a good, I think. Even if it's not super popular at the moment to go Devotion with these, like Witchers are more popular and stuff. But overall, if you want to put 4 fishing cards in your deck and it happens to be Devotion, this is a really great card to put in your deck because it just has that 7/4 value and it's flexible. You can put it across on a different unit. You can boost the damaged engine. You can play this proactively and put it on an engine later or a dual card, although that's a little risky, but sometimes matchup dependent. You might want to do that. Sometimes you know that you need to hit something really tall like King Trump and you can just play this. Don't think that the Ogroid is going to have the removal because they've already played a Cyclops or something. Then you play your Unsafe, get an extra 4 points and hit over the King Trump. Stuff like that. It has a lot of flexible uses and it's just pretty good. Next up, we're going to hit the Knights. Some of them, we have the Knight Errant. So it's 2 for 5 with 1 armor. At the end of your turn, it boosts itself by 1 for each adjacent boosted unit, and damage itself by for each damaged unit. Generally, what you do is just put this between 2 boosted units, and immediately goes up to a 4 with 1 armor, so the opponent only has like that turn to reasonably kill it. And if it gets to its grace, it's going to give adjacent unit shield. That usually just blocks like ping damage, but if you put it on Immortals, it's kind of insane. It gives you an extra target for your second Sorceress if you've already used up the first one, or they killed it or something, killed your Immortals. But this is an excellent card. It defines the Knight deck. Knight deck's pretty good, pretty popular. I'm going to give this up here. It's just a really strong card for any of those boost-based decks. Next up, we have the Lyrian Arbalister. So this is another 4 for 5. It's got a order damage a unit by 1, charge 1. And whenever you play a unit with order, it gains a charge. So if you're spamming out a bunch of units with order, this thing gets a bunch of charges, and then you blast a bunch of units, usually with an Onager. This is really great in those Mutagenerator-based decks, kind of like these guys, but you can make decks entirely based around Arbalister if you really want to, although you don't see that really anymore. That used to be a older meta type of thing, but it's still pretty good. I would say it's a consideration for a lot of decks. If you're playing orders, you might think about this, although usually just the usually just the Mutagenerator decks will end up playing it because the Siege Engine decks will rather have like more Siege Engines, but it's still a pretty solid consideration. Next up, we have the Lyrian Cavalry, or Cavalry, 4 for 4, where you play a unit with orders, boost self by 1. Unfortunately, unlike the Arbalister, this one's a little bit weak. The Arbalister has the advantage that if you're spamming out Arbalisters, each time you play a new one, it is an order unit, so it'll trigger all the other ones to get more charges. This one just kind of, you play it first, and you play your order cards. But order cards, you want to set up proactively as well, usually. So this kind of conflicts with what you want to play first. And the other thing is it's 1 point per turn. If you're playing order cards, which isn't every turn, it's just not as good as stuff like like the Arbalister and other options you have. It's not terrible, but it's not great at the moment. Then we have Lyrian Landsknecht, which I'm always told I pronounce wrong, and I probably do. So sorry about that. So 4 for 5, formation, 1 damage, and Inspired, 3 damage. So you play it ranged, it goes to 5, it comes back to your turn, does 3 damage. That's actually pretty reasonable. 8 value with 3 of it removal is pretty solid. And if you have it boosted from Mutagenerator, which is where it's mainly used, because then it will come down with like 8 or 9 points on it and use the melee ability right away. Or you can grab it off of Amphibious Assault. It's an alright card. I'm going to stick it with these as well. It's just alright. You can include it in those decks if you want to. And lastly, for the Lyrians here, we have the Lyrian Scytheman, 4 for 4, and it boosts himself by 1 for each boosted unit on its row. You can play this with Meve, Golden Necker decks, or with Witcher decks if you're going to boost everything up on the row. And then you play this and get that 1 point for each one. It can play for a lot. Like if you have 8 boosted units, this is a 12 for 4, which is insane. The downside here is it's pretty specific. It's pretty similar to the Dwarf in Scoia'tael, but it's more specific because they have to be boosted. However, usually what people will do is since they get one of this off of the Uprising leader, if they're playing Uprising, they won't actually include one in their deck. And it's okay to include in a Meve Golden Necker deck, but you don't always get Meve's boost effect off. I'm going to say that this card's okay, but way down here at the bottom of okay. You know what? Maybe it's niche. Yeah, I'll give this niche. Yeah, I like niche a little bit better for this one. It has its moments, like if you have these and your deck has enough boosts and the meta's not like row damage, you can get some pretty good value off of this. But it's really going to be specific to what deck you put it in. Next up, we have the Mad Charge here. This is for the Knight. It's a Warfare. Boost by 5, give 2 armor. If it's a Knight, 2 vitality. So that's 7/4/4 on a special. And if the armor blocks damage, you get above that, which is really great rates for the value on this thing. And the fact that Knights love boost, it triggers Grace. Overall, it fits super well into the Knight deck. You don't really play outside of Knights because there's generally other Warfares you want to play, like in Siege, you want to play Bombardment. But it is a good, solid card for those decks. And even outside of that, you can get the 7 value on this. Like if you're playing this in another deck, I mean, the 2 armors usually doesn't matter too much because if you're boosting it by 5, it's usually out of control. It's pretty much just a Knight card, but it is a good Knight card. Next up, we have Meditating Mage, the ultimate spam card, even more so than Reavers in some ways. So it's his 3 for 4 patience, and its order is gain vitality, equal to the number of patience. And if it's bonded, it gains resilience. So you play a whole bunch of these, and then you click all the orders at once and get a whole bunch of resilience points. Now, this is really bad against heavy control, and this deck is pretty meme at the moment, but it is the ultimate deck defining card for that deck, and that deck's not very good though, so it's going to get the niche tier. But if you ever don't have control for these and they go off, man, is it annoying and difficult to deal with. Next up, we have Onager, 4 for 6, Machine Cheese Engine. Whenever using an order, damage an enemy unit by 1. Northern Realms loves to use its orders. This card gives you extra damage on the orders. Most of the armors do damage. So if you have a whole bunch of orders set up, or you just play this and you have your resupplies, so you're getting orders back and using them again and again. It is a very potent engine. This can do a ton of damage. It is definitely an excellent card. Next up, we have the PFIs, as we call them. The infantries. So 4 provision, bonded. So it just spawns 2 tokens, and then if it's bonded, it gets 3 points on itself. The tokens are great because you can hit them with the Cavalry Revenants, so your opponent doesn't have to set up the death blow for you. You don't have to hit something down. You just get these flanks. And actually, if you play both of them, 6 and then 9 is actually pretty good value. Like the total 15 points for 8. That's not bad for a bonded, right? It's not terrible, but usually you just want to use it because of the tokens and Cavalry Revenants. So it's a little bit specific for that. But I think it's an alright consideration because a lot of decks will play the Revenant. And it also just swarms the board with tokens. So if you're playing a token-based deck like Meve or something, it's just nice to have something like this. I can definitely see the argument for putting this in niche. Yeah, I can see the argument for putting this in niche, and I would maybe put this in niche as well on a different day. But for now, I'm just going to lean towards the okay, because a lot of decks do just play like Revenants and stuff. Next up, we have Practice Makes Perfect. So this shuffles a Bronze Mage back into your deck, and then plays a Bronze Mage and boosts it by the number of cards with patience you've played this game. This is just going to slot in right alongside the other Mage cards here, the Students. It's like a good card in those decks. But I mean, like, those decks aren't great. We'll come back to the mages. I'm debating just putting all the mages into like good because they're good in the mage deck, but the mage deck's not great. I'll just leave them all in niche. We'll think about it. Next up, we have the Radovid's Royal Guards. So when I speak about proactive cards protecting your engines, this is the definition of one, really. It's got 4 for 4 with formations. You play it ranged. It's got 5. The next turn, it gives a unit 2, points, and then 2 armor if it was still boosted. Now, this is a very good protective effect. It's a great way to open up a round and then boost up something else. Usually, though, you don't see people playing this too often because either they'll be playing Musicians of Blaviken, which means you have no 4 provision slot, or they'll play Muted Generator to protect their engines that way by boosting them all with the Muted Generator, in which case most of their cards are going to be 5 provisions, and this is a 4. So it usually just doesn't, it just has this issue where it doesn't fit into most decks, right? And if it's a 4 provision deck with Devotion, they'll play Marine instead. But I think overall this card's all right. You can consider playing it as a card to protect your engines, and it's not too bad at it. Then we have the Reavers. Let's hit up Hunters first. So it's 2 for 2, or 2 for 6. 2 for 2, that'd be insane. 2 for 6 with 2 armor, and it spawns a base copy of itself and sets its power to 1 less. So if you click this order, it'll spawn a 1 base power copy that can't use the order. And then at the end of your turn, it damages the enemy unit by 1. That is highest power. So you click this order, the highest enemy unit is taking 2 points a turn. What you do is you just fill your melee row with these, and then every turn the opponent takes 9 damage on their highest power units. You have a whole bunch of the same card out. So you use things like Garrison, Voimir, boost them all up. It's a very, very annoying deck to play against, but it's not very good. So we'll give this a niche. Reaver Scouts, on the other hand, has a whole bunch of uses. So this can make copies of, well, its orders spawn and play a base copy of a Bronze Soldier. So usually you can do Reavers, the Reavers Hunters. You can do stuff like Cintrian Royal Guards. This is how you make a whole bunch of Cintrian Royal Guards. You can do stuff like Lyrian Arbalisters, which is, this works with pretty well with too. All kinds of uses for this. Generally, though, at 6 provisions, it doesn't fit into Muted Generator at 5 anymore. People don't do that as much, but I'm still going to say this is an alright consideration in a lot of decks. Or do I want to say it's niche, because we don't do that anymore? I'm putting it with niche alongside with Hunters. It's still a good card in a vacuum, but just the fact that the decks that want to play it with the 5 version soldiers generally want to have Muted Generator means this doesn't fit super well. But it's a very strong card sometimes. I think it fits a niche. Next up, we have the Redanian Secret Service. So, no, Redanian Agents first. So 4 for 4 with Veil. So it can't be locked, which is kind of nice. It's got order boosted in your deck by 1, cooldown 2. So it's 1 point in your deck of carryover every other turn. You have plenty of uses for this. You can put it on stuff like set up Cohen. You can do it to set up Big Erland. You can do it on something like Sigi if you really want to do that, or an Arch Griffin. Generally, this card is mostly played in Shoop decks where it's a good enough 4 provision card to make the cut, or you play in Erland decks to set up some boost. So overall, I think this is an okay card. You can consider playing it in a lot of different decks. Next up, we have the Redanian Archer. So this is a 3 for 5 with 2 armor, so it's got a reasonable stat line. It doesn't give you a lot of points, but the armor does protect it, and it's got Zeal Order, deal it damage. You can do that right away, or store up the charges. And it's got the end of your turn barricade, gain a charge. So as long as the armor's not removed, you're getting a bunch of charges on it. And if they remove the armor, they're hitting into the armor, which is wasting points, kind of. Overall, I think this is going to fall right alongside the Arbalister. Very similar effects. Both build up a bunch of charges for onagers, and just kind of put them together. They tend to be played at the same time. What is not played at the same time, because it's never ever seen play outside the tutorial, is Redanian Elite. So this is a 1 for 4 with 3 armor, and it has deploy boost self by 6. So it's conditional 7 for 4. I've said that's alright before. And then it has exposed resets own power. So if the opponent puts 3 damage into this, it resets itself back to 1, which is doubling the effectiveness of the opponent's damage, right? Because if you hit something at 7 with 3 damage, the opponent gains 3 value. If you hit this with 3 damage, the opponent gains 6 value, and you're reset to 1. It's so bad. Like, there's no way really to save this card unless it was insanely, massively buffed, like a ridiculous stat line. So it's going to go in meme tier. This card's unplayable. I'm putting this down here too, I've decided. This has to be, it's the same thing. Like, sure, if this was buffed to like 5 base power, it'd be good. But at the moment, it's just no, you don't play this. Next up, we have the Redanian Knight. So this is a 2 for 4 with 2 armor. It boosts itself by 1 at the end of the turn, as long as it's ranged. And then if it's exposed, it moves melee and damages the enemy by 2. So it's actually some nice synergy with itself, really thematic. You put it ranged, and each turn it builds up its power. And then when the opponent hits it and removes the armor, it charges forward and hits them with 2 damage. It's just solid. It's just a solid 4 provision engine card. And it has the grace, so the knights love this thing. It's just pretty good. Like, it has enough value on it, especially because if the opponent ends up like pinging the 2 armor off to stop its effect, that you get value from it. It's just overall is like really good. You can play this outside of knight decks if you want to just put a 4 provision engine in your card. Engine Engine in your card. Engine card in your deck. Okay. That's up. Hit up Secret Service next. This is 1 for 6. Zeal, Order, Purify an allied unit. And if you do not control one, when your unit gains a status, you summon itself from your deck. Now, a couple ways to use this. One is you use it as consistent thinning, where you play cards that do gain statuses, like Immortals, for example, or something like that, where you put Crystal Skull out, it'll summon out of your deck. And you have a proactive Purify in case the opponent has a lock or something. You can keep it in your deck, and then when you play a card that gets locked, the opponent locks it, it summons itself out of the deck, you can Purify it right away. The reason this is so good is because it thins your deck, which is always really good. I've always said thinning cards are really good, and because it gives you the option to react to the opponent's statuses without interrupting your play pattern. So say like you're trying to develop a specific board, right? Like say you're playing Arbalest here, so I want to go Arbalest, 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 Onager, and shoot off my Arbalest. Normally, if you were going to take a turn to play a Pellar in between there, you're slowing down your development of what you're trying to do. With Secret Service, it comes out of your deck, removes the status for you, you can keep doing what your game plan was the whole time, which is incredibly good. So we're going to give this thing an excellence here. This card is incredibly powerful. It goes in a ton of decks. Thins your deck for stuff that wants to be consistent. It just has so many uses. It is amazing. Speaking of amazing, by the way, I saw what's up next, and we're going to hit Reinforced Ballista. So this is a siege engine with 3 power, 1 armor, and 5 provisions. It also has formation, so you can either play it for the Zeal or play it ranged. It goes to 4 with 1 armor, and it has just order damage by 1, cooldown 1. Now this is really good because it also has resupply. So this can go off more than 1 time per turn. This is the best card generally to get off of your, what's his name? This or Foltest Pride is what you get off of Hansel for the finisher in Stockpile Siege. And in anything with Onager, this card just shoots out a ton of damage. The fact that it combos with your Warfares means you can hit things that you might have a ceiling for. You can like ping with this, hit with Boiling Oil. This gets reset, hit again, reach 7. Has a ton of damage potential, ton of engine potential, and it's just super good card. Next up, we have the other Reinforce, which is Trebuchet. Reinforced Trebuchet is 5 for 5, range, damage a random enemy on the range row by 1, and crew damage any enemy by 1. Unfortunately for the Trebuchet, you only see this off of Siege. The fact that it plays range, like people, if you're playing Siege, oops, that's not where that card is going, we're just talking about it. So generally, if you're playing Siege, people know you're going to play Siege. They're playing like Siege engines and stuff. It's pretty easy to tell when a deck is a Siege deck, and opponents will just not play ranged. That used to be punishable by playing things like Lacerate, but that was like years and years ago. People don't do that anymore. So generally, the opponent just plays around this. Sure, you can give it crew, but that's a little slow. This card, I don't want to put it in weak necessarily. Is it weak, though? Is this thing weak, or is it okay? I'm going to stick it in okay. No, it's... I'm going to stick it in weak. I kind of want to put it in okay because it got buffed recently and maybe people haven't experimented with it enough, but I don't really think people are going to play this. I've thought about it myself as a 5 version card and Muted Generator, but these are all better options up here. So I think for now it's still in weak, unfortunately. Next up, we have the Rivian Pikemen. I think that's what these guys are. Yeah, Rivian Pikemen. 4 for 5. Not as good as they are in Thronebreaker, but order damage by 2, and Death Blow reduces the cooldown of each unit on this row by 1. Inspires always trigger the Death Blow. So, this card is, unfortunately, despite its cool effect, right, it's got 2 damage. If you kill something, it resets all your cooldowns. You got a whole bunch of Siege Engines on that row. You reset all their cooldowns by 1, then they can all fire again, and then if it's inspired, you always get it. Like, that's the dream. It never happens. This card is, unfortunately, the real thing holding us back is the 4 power stat line. It's just not great because if you're only resetting a 1 turn of a cooldown, say you have a Reinforced Ballista, you give it 1 turn of cooldown, it's worth 1 point. This thing did 2. You're still getting 7 for 5 there. You really have to reset at least 3 or 4 siege engines with this for it to be good, and that's not going to happen really. So if this had higher base power, like so it's 5 base power maybe, or maybe it's cheaper, but at the moment this thing is, I kind of want to put it in weak, but realistically, it deserves to be down here. Like, you have to reset too many siege engines for this to be good, and at that point, you probably just use your stockpile leader chargers anyway, because it's spawning the 2 power tokens on that row. And that would fill up the row, so you'd losing out on points. So I think, unfortunately, this card is bad. It definitely needs to be buffed. Next up, we have Runeword. Runeword's interesting. So create and play a bronze Northern Realms Mage, give it shield. So you're playing a mage and protecting it. It gives you some options. If you're playing Rune Mage, you can actually see most of the choices and have some good options here. This generally just gets played in the Mage decks. But I think overall it's better than those because you do spawn stuff. There are like Kerack decks. There's a spell for like Alzer, but realistically, it's probably only getting played in mages. I think I have to adjust the mages. I put them on here first, and I don't think I followed my own logic, so we'll come back to those. Put this with it for now. Next up, we have the Ship Ballista. This card used to be abused for some insane decks. Let's try to make a 3,000 power unit with 3,000 subscriber special. This is how I was going to do it, but I only got like 2,500. Anyway, Ship Ballista has 4 for 6 with 2 armor and damage any unit by 2, then boost a random non-boosted unit in your deck with the excess damage dealt, and the damage increases each time you use an order. So if you build up a whole bunch of orders, say by spamming Lyrian Arbalists, and then this thing does like 40 damage, it puts the boost on a card in your deck for carryover. The only downside for this is that 4 for 6, it is kind of hard to kill it because it does have that 2 armor, so it's essentially at 6 damage that has to kill it. The problem with this is that usually your opponent's not going to have that many order cards, and most of the order cards you're generally going to be playing have like cooldown 1, so this will probably get up to like 6 damage if you're lucky. And if you have that many order cards out already, you're already winning. This is like the definition of a win more card, right? You're already winning because all of your siege engines, which are entry cards, are living. You don't need the Ship Ballista to make you win. That's where I'm at with this card. So overall, I think it's weak. Maybe it's okay. No, you know what? This is what a niche tier is for. It's a niche card. You can make decks built around this where you boost something in your deck. Like you can make your deck have only like Sigi and something like Sigi in it and double the boost or whatever. You can put this specifically on something like Radovid Judgment that is going to come out at the end of the game. But just generally, this card's rarely seen, but it does have its moments. I'm going to leave it in niche. That makes me a lot happier. Next up, we have Siege Ladder. Where's the ladder? 4 for 4 with Zeal Order, move an ally to the other row. Crew boosted by 2. Now, this card generally only sees play in a few different decks, being Reavers, because they're melee locked. Excuse me, you can see it in Blue Stripes Commandos, because you want to move Commandos, because this row is full, you want to click the Commando order again. But there are a decent number of Northern Realms cards that are row locked. And I'm going to give this thing an okay, actually. You can consider putting this in. I don't think it's weak. Like, it has a good use, and it's pretty good at its use. The fact that its crew gives you 2 points means that for a movement card, usually movement cards don't give you too much value. This is actually a pretty reasonable one, I think. It has some okay value. If you want to play something that has a lot of row locked in it, then maybe this is a card you would want to consider. But generally, it's just played in decks that really have issues with row space or something. But I think it's more generically usable than the niche tier. Next up, we have Siege Master. Oh, here we go. Simple card. 1 for 5. And it has reduced the unit's cooldown by 1. And when you play a Siege Engine, it summons itself from your hand to the left of it and draw a card. So it helps set up crew by summoning itself to the left, which means if you're going to use stockpile spawn on the right, all the spawns go on the right side of the row, the end of the row, unless it says otherwise. And the fact that it just thins your deck. It thins your deck. You play a Siege Engine, comes out of your hand, draws you a new card. This card is amazing. It has so much synergy, right? Like, so many decks will play this just because it thins the deck. Mutagenerator decks love this because it thins the deck and you get to your 5 version cards. Siege decks love this because it thins your deck and finds you your cards. Like, pretty much every Northern Realms deck, if they can play Siege Engines, so Witchers won't do it because they don't have Siege Engines in their decks generally. Knights generally won't, but pretty much everything else will want to play these to thin their deck. Next up, we have the Siege Support, 4 for 4, and it has deploy melee, reduce the cooldown by 1, and deploy range, boosting it by 1. So it's giving you essentially 5 value on it, and its orders give an allied unit Zeal. Now, giving a unit Zeal is really useful because it means you don't have to Inspired Zeal it and get the order right away. Generally, you build your deck to have like a specific number of targets for Inspired Zeal. Like, say I'm playing my Zeal deck, I want to have a Zeal charge for Demavend, I want to have one for Fard's Vengeance, I want to have one for Prince Anse's, or for Selkirk, or whatever it is. Or I want to save them and have them for Kedwani Revenants. This gives you an extra 1, which basically saves you from those Inspired Zeal charges. Overall, I think this card's a consideration for a lot of decks. Usually you end up picking something different, but it's not too bad to put in there at 4 provisions if you have a spot for it. Next up, we have the Siege Tower. So this guy is going to be 3 for 4. Zeal Order, again, gain Vitality 2, and Crew boost self by 2. Essentially, what this ends up being is about a 1 point per turn bronze engine at 4 provisions, which is pretty solid. It doesn't have resupply on it, but generally the fact that you can put like winches on it or whatever, it's generally just really solid to put in as a card. It goes alongside Redanian Knight. It goes in all the same decks, and you can still play in decks outside of that as just a 4 provision engine card. Like, they're pretty similar in that regard. They're both quite good. Next up, is this Volunteers? Smoke 'em out. That's what it's called. It spawns the Volunteers. So Smoke 'em out, it's a 4 provision warfare, spawns 2 Volunteers, and if you control a boosted unit, also boost them by 1. Unlike, say, the Syndicate or your Congregation, the payoff for this isn't an extra token, which is probably what you want in the token-based decks. It gives the tokens you've played +1. So like in a real game, you'd play this for like giving Lyrian Scytheman extra boosted guys. You get the 2 tokens for crew. Like, I think that's what they're going for with this. Unfortunately, it's just not it. This card is completely a meme. I don't think I've ever seen this card played. Actually, no, I think I saw it once in a Shoop deck. But I mean, this card's really not what you want to be doing. The value is kind of hard to get. Like, you have a boosted unit, you get 6, sure. There's better things to do than that in every case. Next up, we have, getting into some knights here, we have the Squire. So Squire's a 4 for 4. It has boost the next unit you play by 2. If it's a knight, you can use it with the end of your turn, boost self by 1. So what you do is you infuse your, what's his name, Vandergrift with this, so that carries over because it keeps the infusion. And you just get a bunch of points. It's just a really solid knight card. I'm going to stick this in probably good. It's just a really solid knight card. It's definitely better than this, but I mean, I don't think it's deck defining to knights. It is really good, though. You don't play it outside of knights. I think I'm going to stick it here. I'm pretty happy with that. Next up, we have the one that spawns the Witcher tokens. Oh, I don't remember what it's called, apparently. Or how to spell. My defense, my microphone's getting in the way here. Target practice, that's what this thing's called. So boost the unit by 4. If there's a Witcher on the unit's row, spawn a student. So value-wise, it's getting 6, which isn't amazing. But that student is almost certainly being transformed into an adept by an adept, in which case this is playing for 9, which is really great value. So Witcher decks, this is a really solid way to just get points and make tokens. Because of that and the prevalence of Witcher decks at the moment, I'm going to give it good. If Witcher decks were a little bit less popular or less good at the moment, I think it'd go down. But for now, I'm going to say this is good. It's also a warfare, so you can find it. And if you are playing siege engines in your Witcher deck, it'll trigger them. But generally, I just think this card is, I would say it's all right. But the fact that Witchers are it's just going in good because of how good the Witchers are at the moment. Next up, we have the Drummer. Classic Northern Realms card, 4 for 5. At the end of your turn, it boosts the adjacent unit to the right by 1. Synergizes with the boosting, synergizes with just your engine effects in Northern Realms, protects your stuff. The only thing with this is at 4, it's a little bit weak at the moment, unfortunately, kind of like the Trebuchet. Like, they're both a little bit weak. I think this is, if it's got a 1 power buff, maybe you'd see some considerations. But since it's so low power at the moment, I think it just doesn't. I know it doesn't see play, but yeah, it's just not great. We're in what, Temerian now? Got the Temerian Infantry. 2 for 6. Formation. Order, boosting it by 2 for each remaining charge of your leader. So what you normally would do is play Radovid, get an extra leader charge, hopefully get the Radovid's order off the next turn, and you'd have 5 leader charges on your stockpile or something. And then all of a sudden, this thing's order is worth, you play this with Zeal, and it gets something plus 10. 12 for 6 is amazing, incredible stat line. So that is what you do. And if they kill your Radovid, you're still getting 10 points on this, which is good. And then you'd use Casting Contest on this, reset its order, that type of stuff. Yeah, I forgot about this deck. We got to move Casting Contest out of niche, I think. But yeah, overall, this card is just really solid. You can make decks based around this. Those decks have been nerfed, thanks to Flotsam and stuff, getting out of Golden Echo range. But the decks, like, it's still good. It's still a reasonable card. At 6, though, you don't slot it into other decks. You have to build a deck around it. I'm going to give it niche. Yeah, I like Niche for this. It's really strong in its deck, but you kind of have to build a deck around it, and at the moment, its deck is not one of the top decks. You can still play it, though. It's not terrible. Then last we have Temple Guard. Deploy melee boosts 3 units by 1. This is not good. It's payoff for having a bunch of units out, but payoff for 3 units, like 3 units isn't a lot, so it's understandable the payoff isn't a lot, but also the payoff's not enough. Like this is 6 for 4 conditional and having 3 guys. That's just bad. That's really bad. Yeah. So I say it's weak though. If this was at 4 power where people play it, probably not still. I would say this one's bad. And this is the Syndicate bronze as well. So it shows up here as a Syndicate card, but there's is the dual faction Syndicate / Northern Realms bronze. So it also is a Northern Realms card. It'll be in both tier lists. Traveling Priestess. I won't say least favorite card because I think Reavers beat that out, but it's pretty close. So Traveling Priestess here is a 3/4 with Veil. It gets a charge. It has 1 charge. Whenever you put it back in your deck, it gets 2 more. And then it has the order of boosting it by 1. And if it's inspired, gain zeal. So what you do is you shuffle this card back in your deck over and over with Griffin Witcher, with Pincer Maneuver, with whatever. And then at the end of the game, you play this with your Roche plus usually Temerian Infantry. And then all of a sudden, you click 17 orders and do 17 damage, or Onager, so infantry, either one works. And then all of a sudden, you're playing a 40-point combo at the end of the game. That you just built up the whole time. It's super annoying. Like, there's no way to interact with this outside of pulling it with Vilgefortz. And there's just no way to stop it without last say. You kind of have to bleed the combo out early. If they get the combo off, they usually win. This is a deck-defining excellent card for that deck, because that deck is pretty good. And we already mentioned this guy here a little bit. Where is he? Tridom Infantry, not Temerian. We already did Temerian. Tridom Infantry, whenever it gets boosted, damage any unit by 1. It's played in these decks with Traveling Priestess. It's only played in those decks, and Onager is a substitute you can use, but generally, since it's in those decks are pretty good. This card is pretty good. Outside of those, you can use it in boost-based decks, but usually there's better ways. But it is a payoff card for stuff like Drummer if you want to be playing that. Usually you don't, but it's not too bad. And lastly here, we're going to hit up the Winch. 4 Provision Warfare card, boost by 5. 5/4 boost is okay. And then I reduce the cooldown of the unit by 3. This usually means you're getting 2 extra points on the cooldowns if you're playing it. Usually put this on something with 2. So Carol Ballista is what you usually put this on. Or like Siege Tower, and you click its order again if it has the crew. So usually this is playing for about 7 points, and then the Warfare tag triggers a bunch of stuff. So usually this is worth about 7 for 4, which is good. It resets stuff. You can use it on your King Debaven to do him faster. You can use it on your Fard's Vengeance to do faster. These big cooldown cards that have big long cooldowns is really good on. Overall, this is an excellent card, actually. It's just really solid. It's really good. You see it in a lot of different decks. And that is the tier list. Guys, let me take a look here. I think I have to adjust a couple things, like I said. So all this top tier, these are the cards I would consider probably the best, except for this one. I'm going to stick you down in niche, I think. No, did I give... I think I gave Viper Witcher this. I don't think I did. I think Alumni will leave in here for a second while we think about this. Because if we take a look, we've got good... I'm happy with most of these cards. These are all the cards you see pretty frequently, except for this one. But this card got buffed pretty recently, so I don't know if people have really finished experimenting with it at the moment. Okay, these are all pretty okay cards. I think I'm going to stick this card in good. I think Casting Contest is a good card. It has so many uses. Yeah, I'm going to stick this up here, perhaps controversially. I do think it's pretty good. The rest of this is all pretty solid here. These are cards you can see, but don't always see. Niche, yeah. We're doing a quick adjustment here for the Mage stuff. I think I was harsh on them because I went first. It's hard to say. Like, it depends on what I think about mages. No, I don't think mages are good. Let's put these back. I like these in niche better. You can argue with me that these would be in good or whatever. Actually, I'm going to keep this one up here. Not this one. This one. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with all these. We've got niche here. These are pretty niche, like this defining for good for bad deck. This goes by Blue Stripes Commandos. I think I'm pretty happy with this. The only one I have to really consider is Rune Word and Casting Contest. Casting Contest, I think, is going to go in good because it goes in so many different decks. You got the Temerian Infantry deck, you've got the Mage deck, you've got the Reaver deck. I think for that it goes in here, and you could get decent value off of stuff. I'm going to leave this one here, I think. I could see an argument for this to be moved down. I think the amount of decks it goes in lets it be in here. Runeward is mostly played just in mages, but it actually has pretty solid value now. As like a one-of in Shoop decks, you see it too, because they're playing Runeward anyway, or Rune Mage anyway, so this gives pretty decent flexibility. I think I'm gonna put this. I think I'm gonna put it in okay. It might be a niche, but I think I'm pretty happy with this. So this will be the Northern Realms unit tier list. Let me know what you guys think. Did I mess up? Probably messed up somewhere. Alumni probably doesn't deserve to be in the same tier as these other cards. But Mages is a deck that is meta dependent. In some metas where there's not much control, Mages are just like a huge punish to everyone not playing that control. So sometimes it becomes meta. But I think realistically this probably should be in niche. But I'm going to stick it up here at the top and then leave it so people who didn't watch the video will just see it up the top tier and comment about it and get more engagement. Let's do that. That'll be funny. But yeah, I think this probably honestly deserves to be either at the bottom here, bottom of excellent, or maybe just a niche. But the fact that Mages sometimes is meta because of the other meta choices, I think I'll leave it in excellent. But I'll just stick it up here with a big circle in the thumbnail. And all of you guys who watched this far know why that happened and see if people click on it. But anyway, guys, hopefully you enjoyed. This is pretty fun. Northern Realms has a pretty big variety of cards. Let me know if you think Frigate, Casting Contest, and Runeward, those are the ones I think I had the hardest time placing. Let me know what you think about those. What do you think is the strongest bronze card overall in the faction? If you had to ask me, I'd probably just pick Redanian Secret Service, or Onager. Probably Redanian Secret Service. But you guys let me know what you think is the strongest card, and we'll see you next time.
That'll be it for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. And you can check out some more videos over here. And thanks for watching.